Back to Andre, the most important spy. Bagley had asked for the most important thing Nosenko could tell the CIA. The response turned out to be the most important mistake Nosenko made during his 1962 defection in Geneva. When Nosenko crowed that he knew the most important American spy that the KGB had ever recruited in Moscow, Bagley was all ears. Codename Andre, according to Nosenko, this spy was an Army Sergeant Cipher machine mechanic working in the American embassy. Andre had become involved with a Russian woman who, unbeknownst to him, was working for the KGB. He was confronted and agreed to cooperate in order to save his marriage. Nosenko said Andre was a tremendously valuable source. Nosenko also revealed that his boss had gone all the way to the U.S. just to reactivate Andre after the resident juror had lost contact with him. That's this trip here, the Three Musketeers, by the way. Bagley understood that the man Nosenko was referring to as his boss was the chief of the KGB operations against the American embassy in Moscow. Bagley was quick enough on his feet to ask the name of the officer. Nosenko replied it was Vladislav Kovshuk. At the time of the Geneva sessions with Nosenko, the CIA station did not yet know who Andre was. That was a puzzle that Bagley began working on in earnest during a brief visit to headquarters after the end of the Geneva conference. There, counterintelligence chief James Angleton let Bagley review the Anatoly Golitsyn files. After reviewing them, Bagley quickly alerted Angleton to the fact that Nosenko's story did not add up, and that the KGB may have sent Nosenko to the CIA to divert them from Golitsyn's valuable leads. Angleton told Bagley to keep it quiet for the time being, and that he and Bagley would look into deeper into the problem when Bagley returned to headquarters for duty that fall. Slide 40. There he is. Lieutenant Pete Bagley. Oh, go back one. Pete Bagley, yeah, that's where we want to be. By November 1962, Bagley's new job as chief of the counterintelligence section of the Soviet Russia division. Pete Bagley was worried about Nosenko's bland explanation of Kovshuk's January 1957 mission to Washington. Bagley began hunting for a piece that would unravel who and what Nosenko's deceptions were designed to provide cover for. Bagley recalled that the initial piece of this puzzle had been how Nosenko's Andre report allowed the CIA to breathe more easily after comparing it with Golitsyn's alarming identification of Komarov as a pseudonym for Kovshuk. Recall that Kovshuk had used the pseudonym for his January 1957 trip to Washington. Bagley's point was this: a sergeant mechanic working on cipher machines, but not himself dealing with ciphers, could not endanger American security, as might, for instance, a higher military, diplomatic, or intelligence officer. So, Nosenko's allegation that Kovshuk went all the way to Washington to reactivate Andre was suspicious and felt like a pacifier. At that time, one of Bagley's analysts had gathered a pile of FBI documents about their surveillance of Kovshuk. In those documents, Bagley found the next significant piece of the puzzle. Komarov was described as a diplomat on a permanent assignment to the Soviet embassy in Washington, but Golitsyn had described it only as a trip. Those FBI reports revealed that instead of remaining for a normal 2-year assignment in Washington, Kovshuk had actually returned to his job in Moscow after 10 months. That piece fit well with another puzzle piece. The permanent status of Kovshuk's assignment had obviously been contrived in order to provide cover for a mission expected to require an extended stay. And that was a far cry from Nosenko's quickie scenario that his boss had gone all the way to America just to restore contact with a busted sergeant mechanic. These differing scenarios steered Bagley to hunt for the piece of the puzzle that would reveal how Kovshuk's mission in Washington fit in with his responsibility in Moscow, penetrating the American embassy. Bagley wondered if Kovshuk might have had unfinished business with an American that his section had recruited in the embassy but had gone back to the United States. And Bagley eventually did find that piece in the same pile of FBI documents. Kovshuk had not been alone during his Washington trip, a fact that underscored the importance of his mission. Kovshuk's clever use of the pseudonym Komarov to make him appear as a nondescript diplomat did not at first give the FBI reason to take any special interest in him. But while FBI surveillance were tailing a known KGB operative from the embassy, Yuri Guk, they spied him in clandestine tactics with Komarov and a third Soviet official. The third man was also undercover. To the FBI, he appeared to be no more than a Soviet news correspondent from New York. Slide 41. After many weeks had passed,
Is this 21?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
The Three Musketeers. After many weeks had passed, the FBI observed these three men, metaphorically, working together so often that they gave them the moniker the Three Musketeers. The pattern of their activities provided Bagley with the next piece to place into his puzzle. The Musketeers' maneuvers suggested they were meeting with a spy, but the trio worked with such professional skill that even with intensified surveillance, the FBI was never able to observe the spy. Finally, after combining and analyzing the data from the FBI files and Golitsyn's information, Bagley was floored to see the completed picture of the Musketeers. The KGB man the FBI had been tailing was Yuri Guk. He was only nominally assigned as a diplomat to the Soviet embassy. He was actually a provocateur in Gribanov's second chief directorate. The Musketeer posing as the newsman from New York was none other than Alexander Kislov, a KGB agent in Gribanov's second deception department, and as you will recall, along with Guk, Nosenko's roommates in Geneva. At this point, Bagley was satisfied that these three apparent disparate events in Washington, Moscow, and Geneva were not coincidental. Rather, they were adjacent pieces of the same puzzle. In fact, the emerging picture was quite a spectacle. At the very moment in Geneva that Nosenko was telling Bagley and Kiesewetter about Kolchak's trip 5 years earlier, the same two Gribanov deception operatives were now supporting Nosenko's provocation in Geneva. Pretending to have read the KGB file on Kislov, Nosenko now certified that Kislov had no connection at all with the KGB. The unavoidable conclusion was that Gribanov had sent Nosenko to the CIA to divert attention away from Golitsyn's legitimate leads. As the former director of Central Intelligence, Alan Dulles, often reminded his subordinates, once a single piece of a black operation is compromised, the remaining pieces are more easily deciphered. With so many pieces in hand, much of the remaining details of Gribanov's operation were easy pickings for Bagley. Nosenko's story of Andrei, his most important story, could not be true. The facts of Kolchak's trip made that clear. It was not to restore an old contact that led the KGB to send one of its key counterintelligence officers away on an ostensibly permanent assignment while holding his job for him back in Moscow. In sum, in early January 1957, Gribanov's agents had flown to the United States at a 2-day interval. Kislov posing as a journalist to New York, Kolchak posing as a diplomat to Washington. Within weeks, the FBI observed them working together in Washington with a known KGB operative, Yuri Guk. I'm now turning to what is called the Edward Ellis Smith affair. With that much of the puzzle completed, Bagley was ready to test his working hypothesis for the Kolchak trip. Had its purpose been to reconnect with an asset that the KGB recruited in the American embassy that had been reassigned to Washington, the place where the Three Musketeers had been spotted? So Bagley's section dug up records, the records of the embassy personnel departures prior to Kolchak's visa request. That produced a list of everyone who left the Moscow embassy from August to November 1956. One name on the list jumped off the page. The man the CIA had sent to Moscow to support the Popov operation. Bingo. His name was Edward Ellis Smith, the U.S. Embassy security officer. Smith had been one of the minute number of sea officers who were aware of Popov's defection. Kolchak had placed an attractive KGB agent as Smith's maid, and he carelessly fell straight into a sex trap. In September 1956, the KGB stormed in and caught Smith in the act. Kolchak confronted him and offered to do nothing as Smith agreed to collaborate with the KGB. Smith vacillated for several days before finally telling the American embassy supervisor. The CIA recalled Smith to Washington right away, where he was evasive during an interview with a security officer. As a result, the CIA fired him in October 1956. Then the CIA got a lucky break. Until late summer 1957, Ellis Smith remained in Washington while waiting for a job in California to begin. At that moment, the key connecting piece fell into Bagley's hands. That piece placed Smith into a crucial section of the puzzle. It was a note written by a CIA operations officer shortly after the Three Musketeers were apparently meeting with a spy in Washington. The note indicated that during the spring of 1957, the author had fortuitously bumped into Smith on the street. When the operations officer asked Smith how things were going, Smith replied that while waiting to go out to California, he was spending a lot of time in Washington's movie houses. That was the exact period of time during which the Three Musketeers were observed operating around Washington's movie houses, and, as Golitsyn had heard, learning things that put the KGB onto the trail of Pyotr Popov. That allowed Bagley to put a new crucial Nosenko piece into the puzzle. Nosenko had shown an uncanny awareness of the Ellis Smith case, even alleging his personal participation, though that had not been possible. And why not? Because it was during the second half of 1956 that Kovshuk had compromised Smith in a honey trap. Nosenko was unable to participate in that operation because a year earlier he had been transferred out of Kovshuk's embassy section to an assignment in a department unrelated to KGB operations against the embassy. Much later, the KGB admitted they had in fact recruited Smith. So Golitsyn had been right after all. Kovshuk's 1957 trip led the KGB onto the defection of Pyotr Popov, and the Nosenko stories about the trip were part of the KGB strategy to divert American counterintelligence away from Smith's track. At this point, Bagley had come very close to completing Nosenko's Andre puzzle. The picture taking shape now revealed the great pains to which the KGB had resorted to protect its real source, Ellis Smith, by delaying Popov's recall from Berlin and using him after a secret arrest as a double agent in Moscow. That would draw a CIA person from the embassy to contact him so he could be ostensibly exposed by routine surveillance of diplomats. That was the contrived story that the KGB forced Popov to put in a note to the embassy contact, and Nosenko was now backstopping that same story in Geneva 3 years later. Kovshuk did not go to Washington for the cipher machine mechanic. There was a much bigger fish to find. When Andre was finally identified and interviewed by the FBI, his account made that clear. Going to 42 now. Yeah, we're now ready to move to the most epic events, one of the most epic events in the CIA-KGB spy wars. And the next slide here, just for fun. Angleton and Griebenow with lifesavers. Angleton and Bagley locked horns with Schleppen and Griebenow, each going all out to neutralize the successful penetration by the other. The KGB did not want the CIA to discover who had betrayed Popov's treason and when the event had occurred. Go to the default slide because that's too distracting. Popov himself had provided half of the answer in April 1958. A drunk GRU officer boasted that a mole in the CIA had given up the technical details of the CIA's U-2 program. Angleton had sent Oswald as a dangle to start the hunt for the mole. The rest of the answer was delivered to the CIA in the form of Golitsyn's December 1961 revolution. It was Kovshuk's January 1957 trip that had uncovered Popov's defection straight away. At the moment he learned of Golitsyn's defection, Griebenow understood that Golitsyn might help the CIA discover when and where the KGB had learned of Popov's defection. At this point, the CIA was on the verge of discovering that the source of the U-2 leak and the uncovering of Popov was probably a single KGB mole in the CIA. The 15 months between the January 1957 and April 1958 events, the uncovering of Popov and Popov's news about the mole, all of these time and location points were a big deal. Knowing that the truth about the time and location was Washington in 1957, and that the false time and location was Moscow in 1959 would permit Angleton and Bagley to develop a more accurate profile of the KGB mole. This information would also help the CIA identify false defectors. Griebenow sent Nosenko to sow confusion by loading him up with poisonous but tasty tidbits to disconnect the time and place of Popov's uncovering from the time and place of the U-2 leak. And, as again had warned Kondrashev, Griebenow's plan would be highly risky and not well prepared. In his book Spy Wars, Bagley wrote that they never found out why the KGB had such a keen operational interest in Ellis Smith. However, Bagley suspected that Smith might have helped the KGB recruit the mole in the CIA that had never been uncovered. Before discussing Jack, I will finish up the rest of Andre's story. In the fall of 1951, Andre left his wife and children in the United States and went to work in the American Embassy in Moscow as a cipher machine mechanic. Andre's job was to repair and test exterior parts of the machines. Deeper repairs and maintenance were only performed by visiting specialists, and Andre never actually saw the secret rotors inside of the sealed housings. Whenever he was admitted to the code room, he was accompanied very closely by a code room official everywhere he went, even to the toilet. In 1953, a few months before the end of Andre's Moscow tour of duty, he fell for his pretty housemaid's tempting invitation to visit her small apartment. The KGB had installed hidden cameras there. They soon confronted Andre and offered to give him the photos and negatives if he would steal the keys to the embassy's codes. He readily agreed to meet them again. And at the second meeting, one of the KGB officers provided him with special paper and a flashlight to use on a list of rotor settings. But he never had an opportunity to do so and returned with the blank paper the next meeting. There were no further meetings during Andre's remaining months in Moscow. Apparently, the KGB realized that Andre was an expendable dud that might come in handy in the future. In the U.S., Andre lived in constant fear that the KGB would find him and ask him to commit espionage. He happily accepted an offer to transfer to an Army recruiting station where he could not have access to classified materials. 4 years later, in October 1957, the KGB contacted him and brought up the subject of his Moscow maid and the pictures. Andre was met by a short, heavy-set Russian who offered to return the compromising pictures in exchange for documents that he knew would be useless. Andre brought a handful of unclassified Army recruitment pamphlets to the next meeting, and the short man was accompanied by an older Russian man who Andre recognized from photographs the FBI showed him. Not surprisingly, the older man was Komarov, the pseudonym for Vladislav Kovshuk. So they're standing up this idea that he went to connect with an old source, Andre, and when he was actually going there to meet with Ellis Smith. All right. The FBI determined, Gribanov knew that Andre's 1957 contact with the KGB in Washington would later provide a suitable peg upon which to hang a false reason for Kovshuk's trip and activities with the other musketeers. Andre retired from the Army in late 1961, 6 months before Nosenko's first reported him to the CIA in Geneva. Andre had no access to classified information, and Nosenko's tip surrendering him to the Americans not only cost the KGB nothing, but also helped to cover up Kovshuk's true mission in Washington. The FBI determined that Andre could not have delivered sensitive information, so they decided not to charge him and let him live out his life in retirement without further disturbance. In 1964, Nosenko gave different data on Andre that finally made it possible for the FBI to identify who he was, Army Sergeant Dale Smith. In his first meeting with Bagley, Nosenko had said that the Andre he knew, the most important American spy ever recruited in Moscow, had been recruited in 1949. That was a bad mistake. Nosenko did not join the KGB until 1953. Furthermore, that was 2 years after Sergeant Dale Smith was recruited by the KGB. The truth was that the American spy was recruited in Moscow in 1949, and he was a valuable code clerk, not a harmless cipher mechanic. Nosenko did not know him personally or have anything to do with him at all. After the Cold War, when Kondratyev told Bagley about the successful recruitment of this code clerk, his name was Jack, not Andre, and Kondratyev himself had recruited him in 1949. Let's go to slide 43. The KGB, at the time it was actually called the MGB anyway, the KGB had recruited an American code clerk in Moscow, enabling it to break America's military ciphers at a critical moment of the Cold War. Only 8 people in the world, aside from the recruiter himself, Sergei Kondratyev, knew these things and of the cipher break. At the end of 1961, the first hint leaked to the West about the code clerk's recruitment came on the heels of Anatoly Golitsyn's defection. Let's just stay with that. Golitsyn had learned about the recruitment of an American code clerk, but only that his code name was Jack. That code name indeed belonged to Kondratyev's recruit. To throw American investigators off the track opened by Golitsyn, the KGB put to work its time-tested practice of deception. It succeeded, and the Americans failed to pin down the identity of Jack or any other code clerks Golitsyn had pointed to. In 1948, Roman Markov reported an observation by surveillance of an American code clerk spending the night with a Russian girl, Nadia. Markov visited Nadia and told her that the affair was known. But far from discouraging it, the authorities wanted her to develop it. Kondratyev directed her relationship with the code clerk, to whom the section now gave the name Jack. Kondratyev learned that Jack was unscrupulous and greedy for money. He planned to marry Nadia and leave with enough money to enjoy a rich life in America. Kondratyev met Jack at Nadia's apartment 2 or 3 times a month, and Jack answered all of Kondratyev's questions. Kondratyev began giving Jack envelopes containing $500 US, the equivalent of about 5,000 in today's currency. Soon the envelopes had $1,000 inside. Jack brought used parts of cipher machines to the meetings, and eventually he succeeded in bringing a cipher key settings schedule. He did so again whenever the key settings were changed. Misha, a cipher specialist of the KGB's 8th Chief Directorate, who was familiar with the codes and ciphers equivalent to America's National Security Agency, began to attend almost every meeting. Misha asked detailed questions and gave Jack concrete assignments. Kondratyev began providing Jack envelopes containing $5,000 at each meeting. By the time Jack was transferred to Moscow in late 1949, he had received $50,000 and a send-off bonus of another $50,000 in cash. The value of that $100,000 at that time would amount to more than $5 million today. But for the KGB, the value of his services was incalculable. After the cipher breakers had worked for a time on Jack's materials, they succeeded in intercepting clear text. Jack's information enabled them to assemble a copy of the machine, and they could read American secret communications between Washington and all American posts around the world. This continued throughout the months that the keys provided by Jack remained valid. When Jack's new posting came, he left thinking he would meet and marry Nadia in Europe, but the KGB had made sure he would never get the chance. Shortly after another brutal purge by Stalin, Kondratyev's bosses were arrested and thrown into prison. As a result, years passed before the KGB could pull itself together to even think about reactivating Jack. When an attempt to do so was finally made, it failed. In a talk with Bagley after the Cold War, Kondratyev did not remember or was unwilling to tell why. Go to slide 44, please. Take a deep breath. Now we jump to the other side of the galaxy at the end of the Kennedy presidency. In late September 1963, Lee Oswald traveled to Mexico City. John Whitten, the headquarters CI officer in charge of the Mexico desk at headquarters, wrote a report about Oswald's visit to Mexico after the JFK assassination. Whitten said that when they learned from the radio sets that had been turned on all over the agency that the Lee Harvey Oswald had been arrested for the president's murder, he said the effect was electric. For more than the next half century, Oswald's fall 1963 Mexico City trip has been the subject of top-secret congressional investigations and scores of books, including my own, and Peter's, and Bill's, and everybody else in here. That subject is not on my agenda today, with one exception. At the outset of my presentation today, I briefed you on the case, such as it is, for concluding that Oswald was a false defector sent to the Soviet Union in 1959. A surprising piece of evidence emerged from Oswald's Mexico trip in 1963 that bears directly upon the case for 1959 false defection. Recall that on 31 October 1959, in front of the American consular officers in their embassy in Moscow, Oswald declared he was prepared to tell the USSR what he had learned about radar and something special, a not too subtle allusion to the CIA's U-2 program. Now, just 7 weeks before the Kennedy assassination in 1963, Oswald again dropped a provocative hint, this time in front of Soviet consular officials in their embassy in Mexico City. According to KGB officer Oleg Nechepurenko, who was present when Oswald made the comment, quote, he even dropped some hints that he had supposedly carried out a secret mission in the Soviet Union. Slide 45. The false claims by the CIA and KGB of no contact with nor interest in Oswald remained a frozen glacier for the rest of the Cold War. The most recent breakthrough in the case for a false Oswald defection was a revelation in 2012 by Nosenko's original case officer, Pete Bagley, just 2 years before he died. I'll get to that shortly. However, the first major breakthrough came in the wake of the tumultuous events of August 1991 in the Soviet Union. The collapse of a hardline coup precipitated the demise of the communist system. This, in turn, led to a brief honeymoon with the West during which many Central Committee archives, including KGB records on Oswald, were temporarily opened, and former KGB officers compared notes with former CI officers about this and other cases. Western media got access to some of these files. ABC News, for example, about Oswald's mail being intercepted. Startling revelations flowed from a new and lasting friendship between Pete Bagley and Sergei Kondratyev, one of the most dominant KGB officers during the Cold War. The Soviet tale of denial of interest in Oswald collapsed with the demise of the USSR, and that event completely demolished the bona fides of Yuri Nosenko. Sadly, the CIA has so far failed to apologize to all the truthful officers whose careers were crushed when the agency finally made the decision to accept Nosenko as a genuine defector. Let's go to slide 46, please. We now know for certain, as Pete Bagley and Dave Murphy of Soviet Russia have been deduced in early 1964, that Nosenko's Oswald story was the opposite of the truth. During the years 1962 to 1964, neither Nosenko nor his KGB and GRU handlers had any idea that the USSR would fall and the unwelcome truth about Nosenko would be exposed by a KGB officer, Oleg Nechiporenko. The truth about Nosenko is also annoying to observers today, although they may mean well, persist in hanging on to old Soviet disinformatia, poisonous information to cause harm, distract and divert and divide Western intelligence agencies. And that's exactly what eventually befell American intelligence as a result of the poison that Nosenko, by accident or design, infected the CIA with. Nechiporenko had worked with the KGB's Moscow Regional Directorate in 1958 and 1959 while Oswald was actually in Moscow. Nechiporenko assembled and published the Cold War hard facts about Oswald and the KGB from files made available to him after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the Russian Ministry of Security, and the Belarus KGB directed him to the relevant archival materials. Nechiporenko's book, Passport to Assassination, was published in 1993. I met him in 19 November 93 at the JFK Symposium in Dallas, Texas. During Oswald's stay in the Soviet Union, he was twice covertly interviewed by the KGB in Moscow and several times by the Minsk KGB. His work associates at the Minsk radio factory were recruited as informants. His apartment was bugged and his mail was surreptitiously opened. And not surprisingly, the CIA mole hunting unit also opened Oswald's mail. After the Kennedy assassination, both the CIA and KGB denied any interest in Oswald. One can understand and even empathize with the dilemma they faced. Oswald was the alleged lone killer of the president, and as Whitten recognized, he was radioactive. Yet when Whitten, who was initially given the task of authoring a CIA report to be used for the Warren Commission, made the mistake of poking around in the agency's secret involvement with anti-Castro Cuban groups and plots to assassinate Castro, he was relieved of his duties. Angleton took over the operations, preparing information for the Warren Commission. But Angleton would end up with a lot more than Whitten to worry about. Slide 47. I return now to the revelations resulting from the extraordinary post-USSR relationship between two of the Cold War's most important spy chiefs, CIA's Lieutenant Pete Bagley and KGB's Sergei Kondrashev. In March 1994, a Franco-German TV company had invited retired spy service veterans, 2 from the East and 2 from the West, to chat together about their Cold War experiences in front of cameras. As Bagley entered the breakfast room on the first day of the gathering, he spotted a thin, bespectacled man sitting alone at a corner table whom he recognized as Kondrashev. "May I join you?" Bagley asked. "Please do," Kondrashev replied, knowing exactly who Bagley was. Within minutes into the discussion, old conundrums rushed into Bagley's brain. He decided to ask Kondrashev an important question. Bagley had Vladislav Kovshuk on his mind, and I've mentioned him several times to you today. Recall that Kovshuk had traveled to the United States in early '57 on a trip that helped the KGB uncover Popov's treason. That trip had been rumbling around in Bagley's brain ever since. "Tell me then," Bagley said without preamble or explanation. "There's something that's been bothering me for a long time. Why ever did Kovshuk make that trip to Washington?" Kondrashev could have deflected the question or pretended ignorance, but instead he answered matter-of-factly and right away. "Oh, that was to meet an important agent." After a brief pause, he added, "One who was never uncovered." Just 10 minutes into their acquaintance, the Soviet spy master had confirmed Popov's mole had in fact existed and had never been caught. "Yes, I've long thought so," Bagley replied, and then dropped the subject, knowing that to dig for the identity of that still hidden spy could jeopardize what might become a very fruitful relationship. Bagley just nodded, and the two spy masters smiled at each other, knowing how exceptional their first exchange had been. Slide 48.
Where was that meeting?
In Germany. By 2008, Pete Bagley had made a new acquaintance with a keen interest in Oswald's case, British researcher Malcolm Blunt. They met in Oswald's case. They met at a conference in Raleigh, North Carolina, where Blunt asked Bagley a few questions. Later, they began corresponding, and Malcolm visited Bagley at his home in Brussels at the end of the year. Afterward, the relationship grew quickly. Through November 2013, Blunt visited Bagley 5 to 6 times a year. The discussions were long and intense and mostly related to the Nosenko case. Early on, both set aside their differences. Blunt's belief that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, and Bagley's belief that Oswald was a nut who got lucky. As it turned out, that one difference mattered little, and Bagley and Blunt became good friends. Slide 49. It was during a meeting in 2012 that the most telling moment in the relationship took place. Malcolm Blunt laid out in front of Pete Bagley, piece by piece, the documents demonstrating the capture, as I laid it out for you earlier, of the Oswald paper trail by the security office, the security research staff after Oswald's defection in 1959. Bagley had not arrived in the Soviet-Russia division until September of 1962. As such, Bagley was not present for Oswald's 1959 defection to Moscow and the subsequent subversion of the internal dissemination of records about the event afterwards. However, Bagley was a quick study. As soon as Blunt put the defection records and their original locations in front of him, right out of the blue, Bagley asked Blunt, okay, was he witting or unwitting? Mm-hmm. Bagley knew Malcolm would have no trouble understanding that he was referring to Oswald. Blunt replied, you can't ask me that question. How would I know? At this, and raising his voice, Bagley responded, no, you have to know. Was he witting or unwitting? Challenged in this manner, Malcolm had little choice but to proffer a guess, and with some reluctance he replied, okay, unwitting. With even firmer emphasis, Bagley countered, oh no, he had to be witting. Malcolm believes in that instant Bagley saw that this high school dropout, a nothing, a nobody, may have indeed been utilized by the agency. Lee Harvey Oswald had been a witting false defector. Slide 50, please. But that was at the beginning of the spy war saga. At the end of that epic, Oswald's activities in Mexico City implicated Castro and the KGB in the Kennedy assassination. In my view, neither Castro nor the KGB had anything to do with the assassination of President Kennedy. Well, that is my considered opinion and the result of 25 years of studying many thousands of formerly classified documents. It's beyond the scope of my presentation today. Default slide, please. I want to close with a final remark about Sergei Kondrasev and Pete Bagley. In 1971, the Director of Central Intelligence, Richard Helms, threw in the towel and approved a change to Nosenko status, making him a bona fide defector. By the way, he retracted that under oath in front of the committee. Said he didn't believe it. House Select Committee. That decision followed 8 years of intense struggle, during which Bagley and others refused to agree that Nosenko was a legitimate defector. For that, their careers were essentially over. He was on track, by the way, many thought, to become the director of the CIA. According to at least one article in the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, Pete Bagley was considered one of the very best counterintelligence officers of the Cold War era. He had served as chief of counterintelligence in the Soviet-Russia division, and deputy chief of that division had been Nosenko's case officer. His reaction to the documents that Blunt showed him was a very telling moment. A comment on the provenance of Kondrasev's knowledge about moles, defectors, and false defectors during the Cold War is also worth mentioning. He rose to the position of deputy and then to chief of the first Chief Directorate. Moreover, in that capacity, he was also responsible for overseeing disinformation operations abroad, including whatever the chief of the GRU and Gribanov were up to, and the second Chief Directorate. The procedure for keeping Kondrasev informed about especially sensitive disinformation operations taking place there was as follows.
A little story, John.
Sure, okay. An officer from the second Chief Directorate would bring Kondrasev a stiff leather portfolio that held a report of developments on the operation. He would stay there in the office while Kondrasev read it, signing for having done so, and handed it back in his portfolio. The courier would then turn and depart without leaving any written word and no chance for anyone to see the report. The point is, no one was in a better position than Kondrasev to assess Nosenko. Kondrasev looked pityingly at Bagley and asked, "How could your service ever have believed in this man?" That's it.
Nicely done.
Thank you, John.
Sorry, I got going a little too fast there.
John, when you described Bagley's conclusions about Nosenko, making obvious errors and it was transparent that he was not bona fide, when was Bagley concluding that?
In some instances, as they happened, in other instances, he couldn't because he just didn't have the information yet.
And
but immediately after he got back to headquarters and got the Gleason files, that was the end of it.
And what year was that?
1962.
2 years before Nosenko came over.
Look, everybody's interested in Act 2 in this play, right? But you have to look at Act 1 in order to really begin to assess how to think about Act 2.
Fine, that's why I'm asking. So
Yeah.
2 years
How
before
about
he
Act
came over?
3, John?
Yes, the stuff in between, too.
Golitsyn's behavior, after the HSTA and so on, when he's telling the world that you're a communism is a clever Soviet device and all that sort of thing. And maybe, you've changed my mind here, and I now believe that Nosenko was a false defector. But does that really mean that we should think Golitsyn really was a true one? Because his behavior goes way beyond the case. He was with support of Angleton and Edward J. Epstein. They were putting out poison, really. I think there's no other word for it, poison. Seeing I have the floor, I want to ask two other questions. One is, we both met Nechepurenko. I maybe spent more time than you with him. I think his book was a controlled release. I asked him if he knew. I asked him some questions about the Federal Directorate of Intelligence in Mexico, and he said, "Oh, it's in my book." And he opened up the book and he looked at it and said, "Oh, they took it out," he said. So, and one of the things that I found most interesting, he said that there was no switchboard in the Soviet consulate on Saturdays, which meant that the phone call on Tuesday was a falsified phone call, which he did not denounce in his book. On the contrary, he was creating a much stronger Oswald relationship to the embassy than had existed before. I think that's fake, frankly. I don't think
Sounds
Oswald
suspicious.
did visit the embassy. So I don't believe in Nechepurenko, and I'm a bit surprised you do.
Well, I'm not aware what you said. In fact, that Tuesday call is one thing, but the call on Saturday.
There was no call on Saturday.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Yeah.
That's what I said.
A little louder.
I agree. There was no call on Saturday. They were getting ready to play a volleyball game. There was no phone call. It was all Hollywood DreamWorks. So why do you think that the Tuesday call was suspicious?
The Tuesday call said I spoke to somebody in the embassy on Saturday by phone. So he didn't.
But that's
According to
consistent.
Nechepurenko.
That's consistent. The text of that is consistent with the false phone call on Saturday, is it not?
I think there's two different genuses of false phone
Yeah,
calls.
exactly.
Yeah.
One
There's
is a
Saturday.
call with a lie in it. The other is an alleged call that did not, in fact, take place.
Right.
The Tuesday call didn't take place.
No, the Tuesday call did take
Right,
place,
okay.
and the man who is, I'm sure, not the Oswald we think of,
Right.
is lying. And then, by the way, it's just a question. Are you absolutely convinced that the man who was Lee Harvey Oswald in Russia was, in fact, the man picked up in Dallas in '63?
Not at all. And I've gone over to the view in Mexico City that maybe it's him, maybe it's not. So I'm not going to be dogmatic about it.
Okay.
He could have been there and impersonated, or could have been not there at all.
I think he was. There is a fragment of a release which says that the man who made the phone call spoke horrible Russian and English.
Mm-hmm.
So I do not think that was the man in Dallas. And I frankly think if this is completely anecdotal, but I once had an hour-long conversation with Marina where I was trying my hardest not to bring up the assassination. We were talking about literature, and I said, did she like Henry James? And she said she'd never heard of Henry James. Who was Henry James? And I said, oh, he's sort of like the American Turgenev. And she said, oh, Turgenev. Alec really loved Turgenev. The man who checked out books from the New Orleans Public Library was not a lover of Turgenev. Okay.
Can I ask you a question about your conversation with Marina? Was that, I don't know, circa well past the events?
Oh, yeah.
obviously?
There was a conference in '93, I believe, in
Okay.
Cambridge.
At Harvard.
Yes, but no, then about 2 years later, it was November the 22nd, my phone rang, and it was Marina. She phoned me. We talked for 20 minutes at the conference, and, I think she's quite well educated. I think she had a fairly dim view of a lot of the people at the conference. And I guess she didn't have quite as dim a view as me, because she phoned me and we talked for half an hour. She said, I wish I could share a drink with you. I said, go and pour yourself one, I'll pour myself one. And it was after that that the Turgenev thing came up. Now, maybe I'm wrong to attach importance to that. I'm a bit stymied by the book that his friend in Minsk, what's his name? It's a very credible book.
Titovitz?
Yes, and I think that my own feeling is it's a very informative book, but also I think a controlled book, that he's telling enough to make us realize there was a KGB interest, but I think that he never says explicitly that the man he knew in Minsk was the man in Dallas, but obviously he's making us assume that it was. And I think maybe the purpose of that book was to make us think. I read that book over Minsk, by the way. I was hoping to speak to him when I was in Russia. I didn't have time. So there I was on a plane, and just by total coincidence, I looked at the map. We were exactly over Minsk.
You convinced of Golitsyn's bona fides?
Yeah, I think he probably is bona fide, but I think Peter's point was that once you're here for so many years and he's getting all this special treatment, right, with Angleton, he's looking out for his own interests, But I believe his initial debriefings, don't you agree with that?
I don't know.
Well, it certainly is.
I absolutely believe you that Nosenko was sent to discredit Golitsyn. That part I think is rock hard.